A routine grocery trip quickly spirals into a confrontation that no one could have anticipated. It's a moment that not only silences the room but shifts the course of an entire conversation. The grocery store buzzed with the hum of daily errands, carts clinking against the tile, shoppers meandering through aisles, some lost in their thoughts, others exchanging quiet greetings. The sunlight bathed the small Ohio neighborhood, a place where faces were familiar and everyone seemed to know one another. But today, this normal ebb and flow would be interrupted by an unexpected and uncomfortable altercation. Near the produce section, an elderly woman stood hunched over, adjusting her glasses with a huff of impatience. Her fingers grazed a bag of apples as she muttered something to herself. Dressed in a faded cardigan, her silver hair pinned neatly in place, she didn't stand out at first. Her appearance was almost grandmotherly. Yet, what she was about to say would make her presence unforgettable. A young man, tall and casually dressed in a blue hoodie and jeans, approached the stand, reaching for a bag of oranges nearby. Daryl, as he was called, was easygoing, absorbed in a text message, his grocery basket hanging from one hand. Everything about him seemed to blend into the background, just another person going about his day. But then it happened. The elderly woman turned abruptly, noticing him beside her. Her eyes narrowed in an instant, her lips drawing tight in disapproval. Without hesitation, she spoke loudly enough for anyone within earshot to hear, "You people don't belong here." Daryl froze, his fingers suspended in midair over his phone. His gaze lifted, meeting hers. She didn't stop there. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The words cut through the air, heavy and sharp, filling the space with a tension that felt suffocating. A few shoppers nearby stopped in their tracks, exchanging uncomfortable looks. Others averted their eyes, pretending not to hear. The grocery store, which had moments ago been alive with the usual hum, fell eerily still. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, an uncomfortable void where no one knew quite what to do. Daryl's reaction was one of stunned disbelief. His brows furrowed as he processed what had just happened. For a split second, it seemed like he might speak, fire back with words of his own. But instead, he took a deep breath. His face was calm, composed, as if he was carefully considering how to respond. The elderly woman, still clutching her apples, stood unmoving. There was no apology in her eyes, only defiance, as though she had said exactly what she meant. The tension was so thick it could be felt physically. A young mother, instinctively, grabbed her child's hand and pulled them away, her eyes flicking nervously to Daryl. An older man, just a few feet away near the potatoes, glanced over at him, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The silence that held the room in place was more deafening than any words. Daryl stood still, gripping the handle of his basket as the world around him seemed to shrink. The hum of the store, the shuffle of footsteps, all of it faded into a distant murmur. Every eye in the store was now on him, the weight of the woman's words hanging heavy in the air. She did not back down. Her chin lifted as she adjusted her cardigan once again, daring him to speak. Nearby, a young employee, who had been stacking bananas, froze mid-motion. A cashier craned her neck to see what was happening. The small crowd that had gathered neither moved closer nor left. They were witnesses, drawn into the moment, whether they liked it or not. Daryl's gaze shifted back to the elderly woman. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, quiet intensity. 1,000 possible responses raced through his mind. He could shout, he could storm off in frustration, or he could retaliate. But none of those options felt right. Instead, he gave himself a moment, as if to center himself amidst the storm of emotions. Then, he spoke. His voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate, slicing through the tense atmosphere. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't a demand for an apology. It was reflective, almost as though he were offering her a chance to reconsider. But the woman's response was dismissive. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising, clearly unrepentant. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The words hit the air like a slap. A young woman nearby, frozen in shock, gasped audibly. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Yet, Daryl remained steady, unmoved by the rising tension. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move any closer. Instead, he allowed a long pause to follow, letting her words sink in, letting the weight of the moment resonate with the onlookers. Finally, Darryl nodded slowly, his calmness almost unsettling in its strength. "All right," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "Let's talk about that. Since you brought it up." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting. What would he say next? The storm was coming, but no one could have predicted how it would unfold. Darryl shifted his weight, carefully placing his grocery basket on the floor. Every movement seemed deliberate, like each action was part of some quiet ritual. His calmness, rather than diminishing, seemed to draw the crowd in. Even those who had pretended not to listen found themselves inching closer, whether they wanted to or not. He turned his gaze fully to the elderly woman, locking eyes with her not in anger, but in a quiet determination that made her uncomfortable. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice now firm and clear. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." His words carried weight, each one carefully chosen, each one resonating deeply within the silence. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he continued, letting the words settle. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back so his children might have a better life. His father, he was a slave. Kidnapped, beaten, sold like property. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in." The elderly woman's lips tightened, but she didn't speak. The crowd, however, was riveted. A man near the dairy section, who had been checking his phone, put it down entirely. An older couple exchanged hushed whispers, still watching, not daring to look away. "My grandfather," Darryl continued, his voice gaining strength, "fought in World War II. Fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to come back and be treated like dirt. Couldn't sit at the same counters. Couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why?" The room was quieter now. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade. Darryl's gaze never wavered from the elderly woman. Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him. The silence was almost deafening now, the room hanging on every word. "My parents," Darryl said, his tone softening but losing none of its intensity, "they fought too. Not with guns or fists, but by working every day. Raising me to believe in kindness, respect, and hard work." His voice softened as he spoke of his mother. "My mother's a teacher. She spent her whole life helping kids, no matter what they look like." The room remained absolutely still. The ordinary hum of a grocery store was shattered in an instant. What seemed like a typical errand, the kind that happened every day, quickly transformed into an unforgettable confrontation. An elderly woman's words, sharp and hateful, cut through the aisles, directed at a young man standing nearby. What happened next not only silenced the room but changed the very air around them. It was a sunny afternoon in a small Ohio town, the sort of place where everyone knew everyone, and daily routines played out like clockwork. People drifted through the aisles, some absorbed in their thoughts, others sharing quiet conversations. But all of that changed near the produce section. There, an elderly woman, likely in her late 70s, adjusted her glasses, her movements quick and impatient as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair gave her an air of quiet, unassuming routine. But what came next? It was anything but. Dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, Darryl, a young black man, approached the stand. He moved easily through the aisles, balancing his basket of groceries in one hand, texting on his phone with the other. He was calm, polite, and blended seamlessly into the background. But then, everything changed. The elderly woman turned abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she spotted him. Her lips pressed tight, and without hesitation, she spoke, "You people don't belong here." The words rang out, startling everyone nearby. Darryl froze, his fingers hovering over his phone, before his gaze met hers. She wasn't done. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" she snapped. The air thickened with tension. Several shoppers froze, unsure of what to do. Others shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks, but no one dared to intervene. The rhythm of the store halted, replaced by an awkward, suffocating silence. The stillness seemed to stretch on endlessly. Darryl stood there, momentarily stunned. His brow furrowed, his mind racing through countless possible reactions. He could lash out. He could storm off. But none of those responses felt right. Instead, he inhaled slowly, his face betraying no emotion as he considered his options. The elderly woman remained defiant, clutching her apples, unmoved by the weight of her words. The tension in the store was so thick, it was almost tangible. A young mother, sensing the shift in energy, quickly ushered her child away. An older man, standing near the potatoes, glanced nervously at Daryl, waiting for him to react. The silence that followed weighed heavily, like a storm that had yet to break. For a long moment, Daryl stood still, his hand gripping his grocery basket, his presence filling the space. The world around him seemed to shrink. Every sound in the store faded. Every face was turned toward him, waiting. The words of the elderly woman hung in the air, unbearable, like a stench no one could escape. She didn't back down. Her stance was firm, her expression one of defiance. She adjusted her cardigan, her chin lifting in a silent challenge, daring him to respond. A young employee, just a few feet away, froze, unsure of whether to step in or stay out of it. The crowd, too, was frozen, drawn to the unfolding moment, but hesitant to intervene. Finally, Daryl spoke. His voice cut through the thick silence, calm and deliberate. "Ma'am," he began, his words steady and controlled, "do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a challenge. It was an invitation to think, to pause. But she wasn't interested in reflection. She shot back quickly, her voice sharp, "I said what I said." Her words hung in the air like a final warning. The crowd stood motionless, stunned by the audacity of her response. But Daryl didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. Instead, he let the silence stretch, forcing her words to echo in everyone's minds. And then, finally, he spoke again, his calmness almost unsettling. "All right," he said, his tone never wavering, "let's talk about that. Since you brought it up." The room held its breath. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one expected what Daryl said next. He set his basket down carefully, his calmness a force that seemed to draw everyone in. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his eyes meeting hers. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Each word he spoke carried the weight of history, each one landing with precision. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," Daryl continued, his voice steady but gaining strength. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back so his children could have a better life. His father? He was a slave. Kidnapped, beaten, sold like property. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in." The elderly woman's face flushed. Her lips tightened, but she couldn't find the words. The crowd was captivated, drawn into Daryl's story. A man near the dairy section, who had been distracted by his phone, lowered it, his attention fully on the moment. An older couple whispered, but their eyes never left Daryl. "My grandfather," Daryl continued, his voice unwavering, "fought in World War II. Fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, but when he came back, they wouldn't let him sit at the same counters, drink from the same fountains." He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. "But he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him."